Did you ever wonder what would have happened if devil fruits didn't exist? What would happen to Luffy and his crew in this scenario? And most importantly, what would happen to all other devil fruit users? Would some of them even be alive? Well, first of all, in this world, devil fruits would be nothing more than a myth, and the ability that would reign supreme across the Grand Line would be Haki. Contrary to the original story, every pirate and marine would know of Haki and would train it from a very young age. Luffy's story would begin similarly to the original, with him growing up in Fuchsia Village and idolizing Shanks. Considering that this is the world where most people know about Haki, Luffy would also learn about it and would beg Shanks to teach him so he can become a pirate too. Now, in the original timeline, Shanks knew Luffy was one chosen to wield the Nika fruit, so he wanted to let Luffy develop on his own. However, this time, without devil fruits around, Luffy would be just a regular kid to Shanks, so he might actually agree to teach him a few tricks. Over the next few years, Shanks would teach Luffy the basics of Haki whenever he had spare time, and Luffy's natural potential would leave the red hair pirates impressed. One day at Makino's bar, mountain bandits would enter and start harassing Shanks. However, this time, instead of just letting it happen, Luffy would get angry and would instinctively release a burst of Conqueror's Haki. Everyone in the bar besides Shanks' crew would immediately drop to the floor. Although surprised, Shanks would immediately recognize Luffy's potential, seeing a younger version of himself in the boy. Shanks would then ask Luffy what his dream is, with Luffy replying that he wants to be the Pirate King, the freest person in the world. Shanks would laugh at first, but would then take off his straw hat and place it on Luffy's head, telling him to return it once he reached that goal. After Shanks finally leaves the island, Luffy's resolve would only harden, and he would begin practicing Haki on his own, testing his limits every day. Soon, Sabo and Ace would come into his life, and the three brothers would train together every day. Over the years, they would develop their observation and armament skills to a very decent level. For example, Ace would focus mostly on offensive armament. Sabo would refine observation Haki and agility, while Luffy would focus on both, trying to keep up with his brothers. From here on, things would go mostly the same, up until the day Luffy sets sail for the first time. At this point, Luffy would already be a pretty strong Haki user, even capable of releasing waves of Conqueror's Haki, although he wouldn't be able to control them that well. However, despite this, his 7 years of training would make him a prodigy by East Blue standards. Now, before Luffy actually embarks on his journey, I want to take a quick moment to explain what would be different in the One Piece world overall now that devil fruits aren't a thing. For starters, I think all 3 admirals would stay the same. I mean, even without devil fruits, these guys are complete monsters, and there isn't any other marine who could replace them. However, when it comes to emperors, the situation would be a bit different, as one of them wouldn't be alive anymore. You see, the only reason Kaido won against Oden is because Higurashi used her devil fruit to distract the samurai, which gave Kaido enough time to defeat him. So, without devil fruits existing, Oden would absolutely wipe the floor with Kaido, and Wano would never come under his control. So, who would take his place as the 4th Emperor of the Sea? Well, that's a tough question, but I think the best pick would be someone like Shiki. Although he hasn't appeared in the main story yet, we know he was a dangerous pirate with a massive crew. So, if Kaido wasn't around, Shiki would likely fill in his spot. There are many more changes that would happen in the One Piece world in this scenario, but I'll explain those as we get to them. Okay, back to the story. With his training done, Luffy would finally set sail and would easily send the sea beast flying with one Haki punch. He would then drift for hours before being found by Kobe on Alvida's ship. Kobe would nervously explain his situation, but Luffy would barely listen. Instead, using his armament Haki, he would start easily overpowering everyone on the ship, including Alvida. After one clear punch, Alvida's mace would be broken, and she would be sent flying. Luffy, along with Kobe, would then proceed towards Shellstown. There, Luffy would soon learn about Zoro and would attempt to free him. Not much would change during this arc. The only difference would be that Luffy would use Haki to defeat Morgan and his Marines instead of his Devil Fruit. This would leave everyone speechless, and they would wonder how someone so young can use Haki so well. After the battle, Luffy would leave Kobe on the island to chase his dreams while he continues his journey with Zoro. Once in Orange Town, Luffy would cross paths with Nami again. Their meeting would play out much like in the original story. Luffy would sense that Nami is planning something, but would decide to follow her plan anyway just to see what would happen. However, when they finally encounter Buggy, it wouldn't be the same old clown we grew to love. You see, in this world, Buggy would only be a small-time criminal, not the man feared across the East Blue. In the main story, his Devil Fruit protected him from most attacks, but considering Devil Fruits don't exist now, he wouldn't have the courage to do anything big. All he would do is terrorize the locals of Orangetown and demand treasure. He wouldn't even have a bounty yet. The moment Buggy starts his antics, Luffy would simply step forward, release a wave of haki, and every member of Buggy's crew would collapse instantly in front of him. The fight would literally end in seconds. After Luffy leaves, Buggy would be sent to Orangetown Prison by the locals and would eventually be transferred to a marine base where he would meet Alvida. While on their way towards Syrup Village, Luffy and Zoro would start bonding a bit. They would start talking about haki, and Zoro would reveal that he knows armament haki too. In case you forgot, Zoro was the infamous bounty hunter in the East Blue for years, so in this world, it's very likely that he would know haki, at least to some extent. Anyway, the two would then start training together and would teach each other a couple of tricks. At Syrup Village, the Straw Hats would get caught up in Usopp's mess. Luffy wouldn't intervene immediately, choosing to let Zoro show what he knows. However, one important thing to remember here is that Kuro was also once a notorious pirate, so he would probably know some haki too. Although Zoro would hold his ground against him pretty well, Kuro's weird fighting style would make it really hard for Zoro to keep up. However, after Luffy steps in, Kuro would be done for and would be slammed into the ground with an armament haki punch. The Straw Hats would then claim the Going Merry and prepare to set sail. Not long after, a giant bird would swoop down and grab Luffy, just like in the main story. However, instead of panicking, he would laugh. After a while, he would release a calm burst of haki, forcing the bird to land gently onto Barati. Here, the Straw Hats would meet Sanji. Similar to Zoro, Sanji would already know some haki due to Judge teaching it to him early on in his life. Luffy would take interest in him right away, but Sanji would decline, saying that he doesn't want to be a pirate. Luffy, being Luffy, obviously wouldn't take no for an answer and would decide to stay on Barati for a few days in order to convince him. He would spend that time eating through the kitchen supply and pestering Sanji every day. Through all of it, Luffy would get to understand the cook's personality and backstory. From here, everything would go mostly the same, with Zoro challenging Mihawk and Luffy and Sanji battling Krieg and his crew. In this version, Krieg would also know a bit of haki and would be armed with dozens of weapons, but it just wouldn't be enough. Luffy would use a basic version of observation haki to read every incoming attack, dodging effortlessly. He would then finish the fight with his armament-coated fist, shattering Krieg's armor. Seeing Luffy's strength in this version of the story, Nami wouldn't try to steal the ship and leave the crew. Instead, she would openly ask Luffy and the others to help her free her village. Luffy would agree immediately, and the crew would set sail with Sanji on board. Without wasting much time on this arc, everything would go the same pretty much. Nobody in Arlong's crew had a devil fruit in the first place, so there wouldn't be any changes and the Straw Hats would easily deal with them. Afterward, on their way to the Grand Line, both Zoro and Sanji would question Luffy about his mastery over haki, but Luffy would just laugh it off, explaining how he learned most of it on his own. He did it by fighting animals stronger than him and pushing himself to his limits. From then on, the crew would begin taking haki seriously, though not everyone would show progress. Zoro would adapt quickly, Sanji would follow close behind, while Nami and Usopp would struggle to even feel it. As they reached Loguetown, the crew would split up to go shopping for supplies. Soon, Smoker would hear about their arrival and would move in to confront them. Now, in this world, Smoker would still be a Marine captain known for his raw strength and mastery of haki. However, without a Logia Devil Fruit, he would be significantly weaker. As soon as Smoker spots Luffy, he would lunge forward, his fists coated in haki. To his surprise, Luffy would easily block the attack and punch Smoker right through the wall. The Marines nearby would freeze, too stunned to react. The Straw Hats would take this opportunity to flee and would finally sail towards the Grand Line. Dragon would watch all of this unfold from a distance, but this time he wouldn't create wind to help the Straw Hats escape since, well, he wouldn't have his Devil Fruit. Anyway, as the crew enters the Grand Line, they would spot Laboon ramming into the mountain again and again. Instead of fighting, Luffy would dive straight into the sea and swim towards the whale. Yeah, Luffy can swim in this version of the story, which is pretty cool. Using haki, he would project his presence onto Laboon's mind, calming the whale instantly. From the shore, Crocus would watch impressed. He would wonder where this young kid learned to use haki this well. After a quick chat with Crocus, Luffy would place his hand on Laboon's head and tell him to stop hurting himself. He would then promise they would come back one day before taking his leave. Now, in case you're wondering why Vivi didn't appear during this arc, well, it's because she would still be in Alabasta as a princess. Okay, let me explain. The only reason Vivi went undercover was because she wanted to take down Crocodile. However, Crocodile wouldn't really be a problem in this scenario. You see, without his powerful Sand Logia, it's really unlikely Crocodile would ever become a warlord of the sea. I mean, as soon as Luffy learned the weakness of the Sand Fruit, he gave Crocodile the beating of his life, which just goes to show that he's nothing without his fruit. Without his title and powers, Crocodile would pretty much just be an average pirate sailing through the Grand Line. In short, Crocodile never tries to overthrow Alabasta, Vivi stays the princess, and civil war never happens. Cool, right? Anyway, without Vivi on board, the crew would continue their journey as usual, following the log pose, which would lead them straight to Little Garden. When they dock, the crew would split up like before. While exploring, Luffy would sense two strong auras clashing deep in the forest. He would rush ahead and find two giants locked in battle. As soon as they sensed Luffy's haki, both giants would stop mid-swing. They'd be stunned that someone so small would give off such an overwhelming presence. They would ask him who he is, but Luffy would just laugh and say that he is the future king of pirates. This would make the giants laugh, and they would immediately become friends with him. The giants would then share their story about fighting for honor, and the Straw Hats would end up spending their days peacefully among them. They would hunt together, train together, and the giants would even help the crew sharpen their haki. Since Mr. 3 and Miss Golden Week wouldn't appear this time around, the crew wouldn't have to fight anyone and would soon be on their way. Back at sea, things would go smoothly until Nami collapses from a sudden illness. Her condition would worsen quickly, forcing the crew to make an emergency stop at Drum Island. However, this island would be much different than how you remember it. First off, without devil fruits existing, Chopper would still be just a normal reindeer. Without spending his time with Chopper, it's also possible Huey-Look would be able to complete his cherry blossom experiment much earlier, which means the entire island would be covered with pink snow. As the crew docks on this new island, Dalton would immediately meet them. After explaining Nami's sickness, Dalton would agree to take the crew to Kureha. After some convincing, the old doctor would treat Nami, while Luffy learns a bit more about the island and its ruler, Wapol. Although Luffy wouldn't need to defeat Wapol this time around, he would still want to do it in order to help the citizens. And yeah, considering Wapol doesn't even have his devil fruit, he would be defeated in literal seconds. The crew would leave the island soon after, although sadly, without a doctor on board. Even though the Straw Hats don't necessarily need to go to Alabasta this time around, they would still make a brief stop there, as the log pose would point them there. As Luffy searches for a place to eat, he would notice a familiar face approaching from the desert. After taking a closer look, he would notice that it's his brother, Ace. His haki would feel intense, controlled, and far more advanced than Luffy's. Even Zoro and Sanji would stop mid-step when they sense it. Ace would greet Luffy briefly before they notice another presence appearing behind them, Smoker. He would charge forward swinging at Luffy, but Ace would easily stop the attack before it could ever reach his brother. Seeing Ace's tattoo, Smoker would realize that this is not the fight he wants to pick just yet and would let them go for now. Now, in case you're wondering how Ace is still so strong even without his devil fruit, you have to remember that even in the original story, this guy knew all 3 forms of haki. Yeah, that includes Conquerors. Even though we never saw Ace use it, considering he was a commander on Whitebeard's ship, his haki must have been super strong. So yeah, overpowering Smoker should be pretty easy for him, even without his devil fruit. Afterward, Ace and Luffy would catch up for a bit before Ace leaves the island. Now, another important thing to mention here is that Ace wouldn't be chasing Blackbeard at all. You see, Teach was on Whitebeard's crew for over 2 decades before he killed Thatch and stole the Darkness Fruit. However, since devil fruits don't exist in this timeline, it also means that Blackbeard would never have a reason to kill his crewmate. Sure, he would still plot something in the background, but he wouldn't be openly chased by Ace. This detail would actually change a lot of things later on. Anyway, let's continue with the Straw Hats' journey for now. Since Alabasta would be perfectly safe, the crew would just leave after a couple of days and head for Jaya. Something you may have also noticed is that since Crocodile isn't around, it also means the crew would never meet Robin. But don't worry, I have a feeling they'd be meeting her pretty soon. Jaya would go pretty much the same. The only differences would be that the crew wouldn't meet Blackbeard there, and Bellamy would be defeated even quicker than before, if that's even possible. Soon after, the crew would take the knockup stream up to Skypiea. This time around, everything in the sky would be peaceful since Enel never came to power. As you know, this guy relied heavily on his devil fruit, and without it, he was honestly pretty weak. So it's really unlikely he would be able to conquer Skypiea the way he did in the main story. Still, he would probably try at some point and be thrown into prison soon after. Without Enel, Skypiea would be thriving, and the Straw Hats would spend some time up there exploring the White Sea. Befriending the locals, they would soon learn that the City of Gold actually exists, and they would rush down to the Blue Sea to tell Mont Blanc Cricket all about it. The crew would then spend a day on Long Ring Long Land, but Foxy wouldn't be there to bother them. Without his devil fruit, Foxy wouldn't be able to win many Davy back fights and would likely be in prison or dead, way before this point in the story. After a relaxing day on the island, the crew would prepare to leave, but this is when they would be stopped by Aokiji. Now, even without his devil fruit, Aokiji would still be a powerhouse and would absolutely humiliate the crew. Luffy would urge others to escape while he holds Aokiji off. Same as in the original, seeing his spirit and considering he's Garp's grandson, Aokiji would back off, telling Luffy not to make any problems for him down the line. However, it's after this that something really interesting would happen. You see, considering Robin never joined Crocodile, it means she would still be in hiding somewhere. Since Saul and Aokiji were good friends, I think it's safe to say that Aokiji would keep his eyes on Robin and would probably know her location. So, after he sees how Luffy was ready to sacrifice himself to save his crew, he would tell him about Robin. He wouldn't tell him much though, only that there's an interesting girl called Robin hiding in Water 7, and she might be a good addition to his crew. Luffy would question if this is some sort of trap, but Aokiji would just leave without saying a word. After getting some rest, Luffy would declare that they are going to Water 7 next in order to find their new crewmate. After arriving on the island, the Galley Law shipwrights would be nice enough to inspect the ship, but they would outright refuse to fix it since the crew would basically be broke at this point. As the crew thinks about what to do next, Luffy would go on his own to look for the girl Aokiji told him about. Following some of Aokiji's instructions, Luffy would soon arrive at the local library. Being as dumb as he is, Luffy would instantly shout Robin's name. Thinking that the government has finally found her, Robin would get scared and immediately attack Luffy. After a short back and forth, Luffy would eventually overpower her, but Robin would push him and run away. After trying to catch up to her, Luffy would see someone taking Robin in an alleyway. However, as he finally catches up, he would notice that she had disappeared without a trace. From here on, things would happen mostly the same. CP9 would initiate their plan to steal Pluton's blueprints and invade Iceberg's mansion. Soon enough, Luffy and Zoro would come face to face with Lucci and the rest of CP9. The important thing to remember here is that in the original timeline, CP9 members relied on their devil fruits a lot, with pretty much each member having one. This time, that wouldn't be the case, which would make the battle against them much easier. Using armament hockey, Luffy and Zoro would immediately start attacking CP9 members, surprising them with their strength. CP9 would try to counterattack using their Rokoshiki techniques, but let's face it, hockey is way stronger than these dumb attacks, so I don't really think they would stand a chance. The only one who could stand his ground with Luffy would be Lucci, and the two would engage in their epic battle. Seeing Luffy fighting so hard to help her would bring Robin to tears, and she would jump into the fight herself to help him. Together, Luffy, Zoro, and Robin would successfully defeat the agents and force them to retreat. Afterward, during the next few days, the crew would get to know Robin, and Luffy would officially ask her to join his crew. Seeing as Luffy is the only one who has cared about her in so long, she would accept. Since the crew saved Iceberg, he would gift them a beautiful new ship, and they would soon be on their way. Wait, are we forgetting someone? Yeah, well, you see, since the whole NES lobby saga never happened, it also means that Frankie wouldn't bond with the crew and earn their trust, so yeah. Unfortunately, in this scenario, Frankie wouldn't be joining. Well, at least they'll be meeting Brook soon, right? No, not really. Remember, the only reason Brook was alive as a skeleton in the original timeline is because of his devil fruit. He already died once when the Rum Bar pirates were attacked, and sadly, without his revive fruit, Brook would stay dead. Man, this whole no devil fruit scenario is really starting to turn bad for the Straw Hats. They're already down 3 crewmates compared to the original timeline. Well, at least they wouldn't have to battle Moria at all since, well, there's absolutely no way this guy would ever become a warlord. So, skipping that entire arc, the crew would make their way straight to Sabaody. On the island, the crew would search for someone to code their ship, but nobody would be willing to do it for the money they're offering. So, the crew would decide to stay on the island for a bit until they can figure out what to do. During the next few days, Luffy and the others would befriend some locals and would hear about the infamous auction house. They wouldn't believe a place like that exists in the world and would want to go and see it for themselves. However, by the time they reached the building, a huge explosion would rock the area. Shockwaves of hockey would ripple through the air, making the weaker pirates collapse instantly. Once the smoke clears, Luffy would spot an old man standing in the middle of the wreck, surrounded by unconscious marines and panicking celestial dragons. In order to avoid any trouble, the crew would try to leave, but Rayleigh would immediately notice Luffy's hat and tell the crew to follow him. They would eventually make their way through the chaos to Shaki's rip-off bar. From here, everything would go mostly the same, with Rayleigh telling Luffy about Roger and agreeing to coat their ship for free. Before we continue, there are a couple of things I need to explain. First, since Luffy didn't punch a celestial dragon this time around, Kizaru wouldn't arrive on the island, and the Straw Hats would be free to stay on Sabaody for as long as they want. Second, since Ace and Blackbeard never fought in this timeline, it also means that Ace would still be alive. Due to this, Impel Down and the Marineford arcs would never happen, which also means Whitebeard would stay alive. Yeah, that's a lot of changes. Anyway, while coding the ship, Rayleigh would ask Luffy to show him his strongest Haki attack. Wanting to prove himself, Luffy would release a burst of Conqueror's Haki, but Rayleigh wouldn't even flinch. He would tell the boy that if he wants to make it in the new world, he'd have to do much better than that. So Rayleigh would make the entire crew an offer: stay on Sabaody with him for a bit and refine their skills. Although Luffy would want to continue his adventure as soon as possible, he would realize that Rayleigh is right and would accept his proposal. Considering most of the crew knows at least some Haki, this training would take way less time than in the original. So within only a year, the entire crew would boost their Haki significantly, and Rayleigh would tell them that there is nothing more he can teach them. With their ship coded, the Straw Hats would say their goodbyes and finally head to their next destination, Fishman Island. As you know already, Fishman Island was probably the easiest arc for the Straw Hats in the main story, so it'll be no different here. The crew would get dragged into Hody Jones' schemes, but would easily defeat the villain. After the celebration in the Royal Palace, the crew would finally enter the new world, and it's here that we will encounter some major changes. As soon as the Straw Hats resurface, they would find themselves drifting near an island covered with a strange purple mist. Without wasting a second, they would lie low as a gust of the mist swept through the sails of the ship and passed them by. Nami and Robin would instantly notice that it's poison gas and that they should avoid it at any cost. Shocked by this discovery, the crew would choose to leave the island as is and would make their way over to a nearby dock to settle down and wait for the log post to recalibrate. So what happened to this island in this scenario? Well, the only reason this island was inhabitable in the original story is because Caesar came and purified the gas using his devil fruit. So yeah, without devil fruits, Punk Hazard would still be just a toxic wasteland. Oh, and also, the crew wouldn't meet Law here, since the guy would already be long dead due to the white lead disease. So without Law, the Straw Hats wouldn't really have any plans for where to go next, so they would just follow their log pose, which would lead them straight to Dressrosa. And just as Punk Hazard, this country would also be vastly different compared to the one we know from the original timeline. You see, without his string fruit, Doflamingo never managed to take over Dressrosa in this scenario. He originally managed to do it by using his devil fruit to control King Riku and make him kill his own citizens. He then solidified his power by turning everyone he wanted into toys. And yeah, without devil fruits, neither of these things would be possible. I still believe he would try to take over Dressrosa by force, but with Kyros and other soldiers defending it, it's very unlikely he would be able to do it. So after some time, he would be forced to retreat, and Dressrosa would remain under King Riku's control. Anyway, the Straw Hats would soon arrive on Dressrosa and would spend a few days there waiting for their log post to restart. Since there isn't anyone to fight on the island, everything would go without major problems. Also, Tontada dwarves would be living among humans since they were never imprisoned in smile factories. Still, sooner or later, Luffy would find a way to upset somebody and the crew would have to quickly escape and continue their journey. After sailing for a few days, the crew would get hit by a huge storm. They would get lost for a bit, but eventually find themselves on Big Mom's territory. Soon, they would be confronted by a group of pirates flying Big Mom's banner. Then all of a sudden, Big Mom herself would appear from the ship and greet the Straw Hats with a wide grin. This timeline's Big Mom may not be the intimidating figure she was in the main story, but her Haki and physical strength would still be impressive. Eyeing down the crew, she would demand they stop immediately. Confused at first, Luffy would be the first one to step forward and apologize for entering her waters, but would immediately realize that cannons from Big Mom's ship are already aiming at them. Big Mom would then demand that Luffy hand over Vinsmoke Sanji. You see, even in this timeline, Big Mom would want to expand her influence by marrying one of her daughters to a member of the Vinsmoke family. She expected that she would have to search for Sanji all throughout the Grand Line. The Straw Hats made her job much easier by sailing to her territory directly. However, despite the threats, Luffy wouldn't flinch in the face of Big Mom's wrath. Instead, he would tell Big Mom that if she wants Sanji, she would have to catch them. This would anger Big Mom, who would immediately order everyone to pursue the Straw Hats. After days of sailing and fighting at every turn, the Straw Hats would soon find themselves right under the mountains of Wano Kuni. Immediately after coming close to Wano, Luffy would notice that Big Mom's entire fleet finally stopped chasing them. Exhausted after days of relentless chase, the Straw Hats would then decide to dock on Wano to rest for a bit. As you probably remember, I already mentioned how Kaido wouldn't be alive in this scenario due to losing to Oden in the past. This means that the Kozuki family would still be the leaders of Wano. Another important thing to mention is that Wano would be a completely different country from before in almost every way. You see, after Oden returned from his voyage with Roger, the only thing he wanted to do was open Wano's borders and make the country accessible to the rest of the world. He didn't manage to do it in the original timeline, but in this one, he would pull it off. This means that Wano would have a normal docking port like other islands and would also accept outsiders. However, one boring thing about this is that Luffy and the crew wouldn't have to fight anyone since the country wouldn't be ruled by a bad guy. Anyway, the crew would spend some quality time on Wano, befriending some of the samurai and learning about the country's history. They might even meet Ace there, since Whitebeard would come to visit his old crewmate Odin. All in all, everything would go pretty smoothly, and the crew would soon be ready to continue with their adventures. So, I guess this scenario didn't go so badly after all. Sure, some crewmates never ended up joining the crew, but a lot of good things happened too, like Dressrosa and Wano never getting invaded. Feel free to share your thoughts about this scenario in the comments, and you can also click on this video next where I ranked the 20 strongest characters in One Piece. Go on, click it.